imagination. It is not possible to make real progress in penetrating higher realities without going through the stage of imaginative knowledge. This in no way implies that during esoteric training we are compelled to remain for a period at the imaginative stage, as though it were a class to be attended at school. In certain instances this may be necessary, but it is certainly not a general rule. It depends entirely upon what we as esoteric students have experienced before taking up esoteric training. It will be shown in this discussion that the spiritual environment of the esoteric student is important in this regard, and that depending on our orientation to this spiritual environment, diverse methods have been instituted for walking the path of knowledge. It can be of the utmost importance to know what follows if one is preparing to undergo esoteric training. Not merely as an interesting theory does this come into consideration, but as something by which manifold practical points of view can be gained if one is to succeed on the path to higher knowledge. It is often said by those striving toward a higher development, "I wish to become perfect spiritually. I wish to develop the higher self," in quotes, within me, but I have no desire for the manifestations of the astral world. This is understandable when one takes into consideration the descriptions of the astral world found in books dealing with such things. There, to be sure, appearances and beings are mentioned that bring all sorts of dangers to people. It will be said that under the influence of such beings, we may easily suffer harm to our moral disposition and mental health. It will be brought home to the reader that in these regions the wall dividing the good from the evil path is as a spider's web in thickness, and that the plunge into immeasurable abysses, the fall into utter depravity, lies all too near. It is of course impossible simply to contradict such assertions. Yet in many cases this view of walking the esoteric path is in no way correct. The only reasonable point of view is that no one should be deterred from traveling the way of higher knowledge because of dangers, but that in every case strict care must be taken to weather the dangers. It may happen that one who asks an esoteric teacher's guidance will be counseled to postpone actual training for a time, and first undergo certain experiences of ordinary life, or learn things that can be learned in the physical world. It will then be the task of the esoteric teacher to give the seeker the right instructions for accumulating such experiences and learning such things. In most cases, the esoteric teacher will be found to proceed in this way. If then you are sufficiently attentive to what happens to you after you have come into contact with the esoteric teacher, you will be able to observe many things. You will find that henceforth things happen to you as if, in quotes, by accident, and that you can observe things to which you would never have been exposed without a link with that esoteric teacher. If students do not notice this and become impatient, it is because they have not been attentive to what has happened to them. It should not be believed that the influence of the teacher upon the student will show itself in distinctly visible tricks of magic. Such influence is really an intimate matter, and those who would explore its nature and essence without having first reached a certain stage of esoteric training will surely err. Students injure themselves in every case in which they become impatient toward the prescribed waiting time. Their advance will be none the less rapid on this account. On the contrary, one's progress would be slowed down by beginning too soon the training for which one often impatiently awaits. If students allow the waiting time, or the other advice and hints from the esoteric teacher, to influence them correctly, they will actually prepare themselves to hold their ground in the face of certain trials and dangers that approach when they encounter the unavoidable stage of imagination. This stage is unavoidable because those who seek communication with the higher world, without having passed through it, can do so only unconsciously and are condemned to fumbling in the dark. We can acquire some faint sense of this higher world without imagination. Without it, we can certainly attain a sense of being united with, quote, one's God, close quote, or, quote, one's higher self, close quote. But we cannot come in this way to true knowledge in full consciousness and bright, luminous clarity. Therefore, all talk about coming to terms with the inferior spiritual worlds, parenthesis, the astral and the devaconic, close parenthesis, being unnecessary, or that the only thing necessary is to awaken the God within, in quotes, is no more than illusion. Those who are satisfied with this approach should not be interfered with in their efforts, and an esotericist would not interfere in this way. But true esotericism has nothing to do with such goals. It makes no demand upon anybody to become a student. In those who seek its discipline, however, it will not just awaken a dim perception of themselves as godlike, in quotes, but will try to open their spiritual eyes to the realities of higher worlds. Of course, the, in quotes, divine self is in everyone, in every created being. The divine self is also contained and active in stones, plants, and animals. It is not important to feel and know this in a general way, but rather to establish a living connection with the manifestations of the divine self. Just as we can mutter repeatedly that this world contains the divine self veiled within it, and yet know nothing of the physical world, likewise those who seek the divine kingdom of spirit only in vague and indeterminate generalities know nothing of higher worlds. We need to open our eyes and see the revelation of deity in the phenomena of the physical world, in a stone or a plant, and not merely dream away all these as mere appearances, with the true form of God somehow concealed, in quotes, behind them. No, God reveals himself in his creations, and those who would know God must first learn to know the true essence of these creations. Therefore, we must also learn to see what really goes on and what lives in the higher worlds if we wish to know the divine. The consciousness that the God-human dwells within us can at best offer a beginning. Experienced in the right way, however, such a beginning leads to an actual lift into the higher worlds. But this is possible only for those in whom the spiritual, in quotes, senses have been developed. Any other view leads only to the thought that one will remain as is and attain only what is possible to attain in this way. However, the goal of the esotericist is to become a different human being in order to behold and experience things other than the customary ones. It is precisely for this purpose that passage through imaginative knowledge is necessary. It has already been said that this stage of imagination need not be conceived of as a school class that must be gone through. It is to be understood that particularly in present-day life, there are those who bring with them preconditions that enable an esoteric teacher to evoke in them inspired and intuitive knowledge simultaneously, or nearly so, with the imaginative. But it should in no way be understood that any person can be spared passage through the imaginative stage. The cause of danger inherent in imaginative knowledge has already been pointed out in my book titled How to Know Higher Worlds. The cause is that upon entry to that world, human beings in a certain sense lose the ground beneath their feet. the source of their security in the physical world is for the moment and to all appearances entirely lost. Upon perception of something in the physical world, it is asked, whence comes this perception? This is done mostly unconsciously, but it is quite unconsciously clear that the causes of the perception are objects, in quotes, outside in space. Colors, sounds, and odors radiate from these objects. Colors would not be seen floating free in space, nor sounds heard without consciousness arising as to the objects to which these colors pertain as qualities, and from which these tones arise. Awareness that objects and entities cause physical perceptions gives them, and thus also human beings, security and a sure hold. Those having perceptions without outer causes are seen as abnormal and pathological. Perceptions without causes are called illusions, hallucinations, and visions. Viewed only externally, the imaginative world consists wholly of such hallucinations, visions, and illusions. It has been pointed out in How to Know Higher Worlds that through esoteric training, visions and such are produced artificially. By focusing our consciousness on a seed or a dying plant, certain forms, which are nothing but hallucinations to begin with, are evoked before the soul. Observed outwardly, the, quote, flame formation, close quote, parenthesis, appearing in the soul through observation of a plant or the like, and, after a while, separating itself completely from the plant, close parenthesis, is considered on the same level as an hallucination. It is the same in esoteric training when the imaginative world is entered. What was customarily regarded as going forth from things outside in space or clinging to them as properties, colors, sounds, odors, now float free in space. Perceptions break free from all outer things and swim free in space or fly around in it. Yet it is known with strict accuracy that the things before us have not produced those perceptions, but rather that they are self-induced by the human being. Similarly, one thinks that one has, quote, lost the ground beneath one's feet, close quote. In ordinary life, in the physical world, those inner images that do not proceed from things must be guarded against and are without ground or foundation. But to evoke imaginative knowledge, the prime essential is to have colors, sounds, odors, etc., fully torn loose from all things and floating free in space. The next step toward imaginative knowledge is to find a new, quote, ground and foundation, close quote, for the imaginations that are thus adrift. This must occur in that other world that is now about to be revealed. New things and entities take possession of these inner imaginations. In the physical world, for instance, the color blue stays on a cornflower. In the imaginative world, likewise, it must not remain free-floating. It flows, as it were, towards some being, and whereas it floated unattached at first, it now becomes the expression of a being. Something speaks through it that the observer can perceive only in the imaginative world. And so these free-floating imaginations gather around definite centers. It becomes clear that beings are speaking to us through them. And as in the physical world there are corporeal things and beings to which colors, sounds, odors, and so forth are attached, or from which they are derived, so now spiritual beings speak out through them. These spiritual beings are in fact always present. They hover continually around human beings, but cannot reveal themselves to them without an opportunity to do so. They are given this possibility when we manifest the capacity to let sounds, colors, and such arise before our soul, even when not caused by a physical object. spiritual facts and beings are entirely different from objects and entities of the physical world. In ordinary speech, it is not easy to find an expression that even remotely describes the distinction. Perhaps the best approach is to say that in the imaginative world, everything speaks to us as if it were directly intelligent, whereas in the physical world, intelligence can reveal itself only in a roundabout way, through physicality. This allows flexibility and freedom in the imaginative world. The medium of the outer object is absent, and the spiritual lives itself out with full immediacy in the free-floating tones, colors, and so on. Now, the basis of danger threatening human beings in this world lies in the fact that they perceive the manifestations of spiritual beings, but not the beings themselves. This is the case as long as we remain only in the imaginative world and rise no higher. Only inspiration and intuition lead us gradually to the beings themselves. If, however, the esoteric teacher should awaken these faculties prematurely, without having thoroughly introduced a student to the realm of imagination, the higher world would reveal only a shadowy and phantom-like existence. The whole glorious fullness of the pictures in which it reveals itself, when one really enters into it, would be lost. Herein lies the reason why the esoteric student needs a guide, in quotes. For esoteric students, the imaginative world is at first only a, quote, picture world, close quote, of which, mostly, they do not know the meaning. But the esoteric teacher knows to what things and entities these pictures pertain in a still higher world. If students have confidence in the teacher, they can know that later connections will be revealed, which they cannot yet penetrate. In the physical world, the objects in space were themselves their guides. They were able to prove the accuracy of their inner pictures of them. Physical reality is the rock upon which all hallucinations and illusions must be shattered. This rock disappears into an abyss when the imaginative world is entered. Therefore the teacher must serve as another such rock. From what the teacher can offer, students must sense the reality of the new world. From this it can be judged what great confidence in the teacher must exist in any esoteric training worthy of the name. When one can no longer believe in the teacher, it is exactly the same in this higher world as if in the physical world everything on which faith in the reality of one's perceptions had been built were suddenly taken away. Apart from this fact, there is yet another that might throw us into confusion if we were to enter the imaginative world without guidance. And as esoteric students, we must first learn to know ourself as distinct from all other spiritual beings. In physical life, we have feelings, desires, longings, passions, ideas, and so forth. Of course, these are all caused by things and beings of the outer world. But we know quite well that they form our inner world, and we distinguish them from the objects of the outer world as events within the soul. But as soon as the imaginative sense is awakened, this ease of differentiation ceases completely. Our feelings, ideas, passions, and so on literally step outside of us and assume form, color, and tone. We stand before them now as we do before wholly strange objects and beings in the physical world. It will be understood that such confusion can become complete when we recall what was said in the chapter titled, quote, Some Results of Initiation, close quote, entitled How to Know Higher Worlds. It describes the way that the imaginative world appears to the observer. All appears reversed, as in a reflection. What flows from us seems as though it were coming toward us from outside. A wish that we cherish changes into a form, say that of some fantastic-looking animal or an entity resembling a human being. It appears to attack us or cause us to do one thing or another. Thus it can happen that we appear to ourselves as surrounded by a wholly fantastic, often charming and seductive or horrible world of fluttering forms. In reality, these are simply our thoughts, wishes, and passions transformed into images. It would be a great error to believe it easy to distinguish between this self transformed into images on the one hand and the real spiritual world on the other. At first, it is downright impossible for a student to make this distinction. An identical picture can come from some spiritual being that speaks to us or from something in the interior of the soul. And if our development is unduly precipitate at this point, there is danger of never learning to separate the two in an orderly fashion. The greatest caution is the rule in this regard. Now the confusion will be still greater, in that the soul's wishes and desires clothe themselves in images of an opposite character from what they really are. It may be assumed, for instance, that vanity clothes itself in a picture in this way. It may appear as a charming shape, promising wonderful things if its demands are met. Its pronouncements seem to set goals thoroughly good and worthy. When followed, however, they plunge one into moral and other kinds of ruin. Conversely, a good soul quality can clothe itself in unpleasant garb. At this point, only a true knower can differentiate, and only one who is not susceptible to weakening in the correct goal remains steady in face of the seductive artifices of the soul's imagery. From these considerations, one will recognize a need for the guidance of a teacher who, with a sure sense, makes the student attentive to what is fantasy and what is true in this realm. There is no need to believe that a teacher must always stand just behind the student. The presence of the teacher close to the esoteric student in space is not what matters most. Certainly there is the moment when such spatial presence is desirable, and also when it is absolutely necessary. On the other hand, the esoteric teacher finds means of remaining in touch with the student even when physically far removed. Moreover, it must be observed that much of what takes place between teacher and student in this sphere, when they meet, can go on working often for months and perhaps for years afterward. But there is one thing that must surely destroy the necessary link between teacher and student. This happens if the student loses confidence in the teacher. It is especially bad when this bond of confidence has been broken before the student has learned to distinguish the illusory reflections of one's soul from reality. Now, it could be argued at this point that if a connection with the teacher occurs in this way, the esoteric student loses all freedom and independence. We give ourselves, so to speak, wholly into the hands of the teacher. This is in truth, however, not at all the case. The various methods of esoteric training certainly differ from one another with respect to dependence upon the teacher. Such dependence can be required to a greater or a lesser degree, and it is greatest in the methods that were followed by Eastern esotericists, who even today teach it as their own. This dependence is less in so-called Christian initiation, and strictly speaking, its complete omission comes on the path of knowledge that, since the 14th century, has come to be advanced by the so-called Rosicrucian esoteric schools. On this path, the teacher can in no way be disregarded. That is impossible. But all dependence on the teacher ceases. How this is possible will be presented in the continuation of these thoughts, when we shall explain precisely how these three paths of knowledge differ: the Eastern, the Christian, and the Rosicrucian. In the Rosicrucian approach, there is nothing at all upsetting in any way to a modern person's sense of freedom. It will also be described in this continuation how one person or another as an esoteric student, even in contemporary Europe, may travel not the Rosicrucian, but the Eastern path, or the old Christian, although today the Rosicrucian is the most natural. This way, as will be seen in due course, is not at all unchristian. We can go this way without endangering our Christianity, as can also those who suppose themselves to stand at the pinnacle of the modern scientific worldview. But perhaps another explanation is needed. One might feel tempted to ask whether esoteric students could not be spared going through the delusions of their own soul. But if this happened, they would never attain that independent discernment so desirable for them. By no other means can the singular nature of the imaginative world be so well grasped as by the soul's observation. To begin with, we know the inner life of our soul from one side. We are immersed in it, and this is just what the esoteric student has to learn. Not only to look at things from outside, but also to observe them as if we ourselves were within all of them. If our own thought world now meets us as something foreign, and we already know something from one perspective, we can still come to know it from another. We must ourselves become, to a certain degree, the first example of such knowledge. Here in the physical world we are accustomed to something quite different. Here we view all other things only from outside, but we experience ourselves only from the inside. As long as we remain in the physical world, we can never see behind the surface of things. We can never go outside ourselves, quote, slip out of our skin, close quote, as it were, to observe ourselves from outside. This objective observation of ourself is literally our first obligation in esoteric training. This helps us learn to look as well beneath the surface of outer facts and beings. Inspiration. It becomes evident from the description of imagination that through it esoteric students leave the ground of outer sensory experiences. This is even more the case for inspiration. Here, representation, in parentheses image forming, is based much less on what can be designated as outer stimulus. We must find strength within ourselves to make it possible for us to form representations of things. We must be active inwardly on a much higher level than in the case of outer cognition, when we simply give ourselves over to outer impressions which cause the images. This kind of surrender ceases when we come to inspiration. The eye, EYE, no longer supplies colors, no ear supplies sounds, and so forth. The whole content of representations must be shaped largely by one's own activity, consequently by purely spirit-soul processes. And the manifestation of the higher world must be impressed upon what we have created by this inner activity. A peculiar contradiction seems to appear in such a description of the world of higher cognition. As individuals, we should, to a certain extent, be the creator of our own representations. Yet, of course, such representations must not be allowed to be our own creation. The processes of the higher world must be expressed through them, just as the processes of the lower world are expressed through the perceptions of the eyes, ears, and such. But contradiction is inevitable when describing this mode of cognition, for this is exactly what esoteric students must claim on the path of inspiration. Through inner activity, they must attain a result that is compelled outwardly in ordinary life. Why do the images representing the outer world in ordinary life not take an arbitrary course? Because we have to make our inner imagery conform to the outer objects. All arbitrariness of the I, capital I, falls away because the phenomena say what they are. Objects themselves tell us how to think of them. It is not up to the I, capital. Those who will not adjust themselves to the objects have erroneous thoughts, and quickly become aware of how little success they have with the world's phenomena. This necessary human attitude toward the things of the outer world can be designated in cognition by the term selfless. We must become selfless toward phenomena, and the outer world becomes our teacher in that selflessness. It removes from us all illusions, all fantastic notions, all illogical judgments, all non-objectivity, simply by putting the correct image before our senses. If we wish to prepare for inspiration, we must develop our inner nature so that this selflessness becomes our very own, even when nothing outside compels it. We must learn to create inwardly, but in such a way that our I, capital, does not in the least way play an arbitrary role in this creative activity. The difficulties to be considered in achieving such selflessness become the more apparent the more consideration is given to what soul powers are especially needed for inspiration. The three fundamental powers of soul life are differentiated: representation, in parentheses thinking, feeling, and willing. In everyday sensory cognition, representations are stimulated into existence by outer objects, and through these externally stimulated representations, the directions taken by feeling and willing are determined. For instance, we see an object. It gives us pleasure, and as a result we desire the thing. Pleasure is rooted in feeling, and through feeling the will is aroused, just as feeling has itself received its stamp from thinking. But the ultimate foundation of thinking, feeling, and willing is the external object. Another example might be a man who witnesses an event. It frightens him. He runs away from the scene of the event. Here, too, the outer occurrences are the initial cause. They are perceived through the senses, become representations, the feeling of fear springs up, and the will, expressing itself as running away, is the result. In inspiration, any outer object of this kind falls away. The senses do not come into play for a perception. Therefore they cannot give rise to representations. From this side, no influence is exerted upon feeling and willing. Yet it is precisely from these two, as out of a mother substance, that representations for inspiration arise and grow inwardly. If the mother substance is healthy, true representations will arise. If unhealthy, errors and illusions. As certainly as inspirations that originate in healthy feeling and willing can be revelations from a higher world, so certainly do errors, delusions, and fantastic notions concerning a higher world spring from confused feeling and willing. Esoteric training, therefore, undertakes to indicate how we may make our feelings and will impulses productive in a healthy way for inspiration. As in all matters of esoteric training, the need here is for an intimate regulating and forming of soul life. First of all, certain feelings must be developed that are known only to a slight degree in ordinary life. Some of these feelings will be hinted at here. Among the most important is a heightened sensitivity to truth and falsehood, to right and wrong. Certainly the ordinary human being has similar feelings, but they must be developed by the esoteric student in a much higher measure. Suppose someone has made a logical error. Another sees this mistake and corrects it. Let it be clear how great the role of judgment and intellect in such a correction is, and how slight the feeling of pleasure in the right and displeasure in the wrong. Surely this is not to say that the pleasure and corresponding displeasure are non-existent, but the degree to which they are present in ordinary life must be raised immeasurably for esoteric training. Esoteric students must turn their attention most systematically to their soul life, and they must make sure that logical error is a source of pain to them, no less excruciating than physical pain, and conversely, that the right gives them true joy and delight. Thus, where another only stirs the intellect or power of judgment into motion, esoteric students must learn to live through the whole gamut of emotions, from grief to enthusiasm, from afflictive tension to transports of delight in the possession of truth. In fact, they must learn to feel something like hatred against what a normal person experiences, only in a cold and sober way, as incorrect. They must enkindle within a love of truth that has a personal character, as personal and as warm as a lover feels toward the beloved. Certainly much is said in our cultured circles about the love of truth. Yet what this means cannot be compared with what esoteric students must go through in quiet, inner soul work toward this end. As a result, they must patiently and repeatedly place before themselves some true thing or some false one, and devote themselves to it, not merely to train their power of judgment for sober discrimination between true and false, but to gain a personal relationship to it all. It is absolutely correct that in the beginning of such training we can become overly sensitive. An erroneous judgment that we overhear, an inconsistency, and so on, can cause almost unbearable pain. Care must thus be taken in this respect during training, otherwise great dangers might indeed result for our soul's equilibrium. If we are careful to maintain a steadfast character, storms may occur in the soul life, and we still retain the power to conduct ourselves toward the outer world with harmonious countenance and bearing. It is a mistake in every case when esoteric students are brought into opposition to the outer world so that they find it unbearable or want to flee from it entirely. The higher world of feeling must not be cultivated at the expense of well-balanced activity and work in the outer world. Therefore, a strengthening of the power to withstand outer impressions must appear in corresponding measure to the inner lifting of the feeling life. Practical esoteric training, therefore, directs us never to undertake the previously mentioned exercises for developing the feeling world without at the same time developing ourselves toward an appreciation of the tolerance that life demands of us. We must be able to feel the keenest pain when someone offers an erroneous opinion, and yet at the same time be perfectly accepting of such a one, because the thought in our mind is equally clear that the person is bound to judge in this way, and that the opinion must be dealt with as a fact. It is correct, of course, that the inner being of the esoteric scientist will be transformed increasingly into a twofold life. Ever richer processes occur in the soul during our pilgrimage through life, and a second world continually gains more independence from what the outer world offers. It is this twofold existence that will bear fruit in the genuine practice of life. What results from it is quick-witted judgment and unerring certainty of decision, while those who stand remote from such training must go through long trains of thought, driven hither and thither between resolution and perplexity. The esoteric scientist will swiftly survey life situations and discern hidden relations concealed from the ordinary view. One, then, often needs much patience to synchronize with the slow rate at which another person is able to grasp something that comes swift as an arrow for oneself. Thus far, we have spoken only of the qualities that must be developed in the feeling life, so that inspiration can occur correctly. The next question is this: How do the feelings become fruitful so that they are represented accurately for the world of inspiration? If we wish to understand what esoteric science offers in answer to this question, we must become acquainted with the fact that our soul life always has a certain treasure of feeling over and above those stimulated by sensory perceptions. We feel, as it were, far more than things compel us to feel, but in ordinary life this excess is employed in a direction that through esoteric training must be transformed into another. Take, for instance, a feeling of anxiety or fear. It can be crystal clear that fear or anxiety is often greater than it would be if it were in true proportion to the corresponding outer event. Imagine that as esoteric students we are working energetically on ourselves with the aim to feel in no instance more fear and anxiety than is justified by the corresponding external events. Now, a given amount of fear or anxiety always entails an expenditure of soul force. This soul force is actually lost as a result when fear or anxiety is produced. We really conserve this soul force when we deny ourselves fear or anxiety or other such feelings, and it remains at our disposal for another purpose. If we repeat such processes often, we build up an inner treasure of these continually cultivated soul forces, and we soon find that out of such economies of feeling arise the seeds of the inner images that express the revelations of a higher life. Such matters cannot be proved in the ordinary sense. Esoteric students can only be advised to do this or that, and if we do so, to watch for the indubitable results. A careless examination of what has been described might easily make it seem a contradiction to demand from the one side an enrichment of the feeling world with feelings of pleasure or pain to be kindled by what otherwise arouses only intellectual judgment, and from the other side to speak in almost the same breath of an economy of feeling. This contradiction quickly disappears when we recall that the economies are to be effected in the feelings aroused by the physical senses. Just what is conserved here appears conversely as an enrichment of spiritual experience. And it is wholly correct that the feelings conserved in this way in the world of sensory perception not only become free in the other sphere, but also prove creative within that sphere. They shape the matrix substance for the representations through which the spiritual world reveals itself. It would not accomplish much, however, to remain at a standstill with only economies such as those just indicated. For greater results, even more is needed. The soul must be provided with much greater treasure of power to create feeling than is possible in only this way. For instance, as a test, we must expose ourselves to certain outer impressions and then wholly deny ourselves the feelings that typically result. We must, for example, face an event that typically excites the soul, while absolutely and totally forbidding ourselves such excitation. This can be accomplished either by actually confronting the experience or by imaginatively conjuring it. The imaginative method is even better for a truly fruitful esoteric training. As a student, when one is initiated into imagination, either before one's preparation for inspiration or simultaneously with it, one should actually be in a position to place an occurrence imaginatively before the soul with the same force as if it were in fact taking place. If therefore in the course of long inner work we repeatedly subject ourselves to things and events, yet deny ourselves the corresponding normal feelings, we create a fertile ground for inspiration in the soul. Incidentally, it should be noted here that those who describe such training for inspiration can fully appreciate possible arguments against such a description from the perspective of contemporary culture. Arguments can be made, but people can also smile proudly and say, quote, inspiration cannot be taught pedantically, it is a natural gift of genius, close quote. But then, from the perspective of modern culture, it seems almost comical to speak of a process that cannot be explained, yet modern culture itself is unaware of how little it can think through to the end by its own thought processes. Those who expect a devotee of this culture to believe that a more highly developed animal did not slowly evolve but suddenly appeared would quickly be told that a cultured person in the modern sense could not believe in such a miracle. Such a belief would be considered superstitious. Now, in the sphere of soul life, those with such a modern education are themselves simply victims of crass superstition in the style of their own opinions. By the same token, such people will not recognize that a more fully developed soul must also have evolved and could not have sprung into existence suddenly as a gift of nature. Of course, externally, many geniuses seem to have been born suddenly, in quotes, out of nothing, in some mysterious way, though it appears as such only for materialistic superstition. Spiritual scientists know that the assessment of genius in relation to a human life born to this condition, as if out of nothing, is simply the result of that individual's preparation for inspiration during an earlier life on earth. In a theoretical sphere, materialistic superstition is bad, but it is even worse in a practical sphere such as this. Because it assumes that genius in the future must always fall from heaven, it does not bother about the esoteric nonsense or fantastic mysticism that speaks of preparation for inspiration. Thus, the superstition of the materialists retards the true progress of humankind. It does not ensure that latent faculties are developed in human beings. In reality, it is precisely those who call themselves progressives and free thinkers who are frequently the enemies of actual progress. As noted, however, this is only a casual remark, but necessary owing to the relationship between esoteric science and present-day culture. As indicated, the soul powers stored up through the self-denial of normal feelings in our inner being as esoteric students become the riches that will undoubtedly be transformed into inspirations, even if nothing else came to their aid. Moreover, as esoteric students, we would experience how true thought images arise in the soul, representing experiences in higher realities. Progress would begin with the simplest experiences of supra-sensory events and gradually become more complicated. Let me read that again. Progress would begin with the simplest experiences of supra-sensory events, and gradually more complicated higher ones arise if we continue to live inwardly according to the directions suggested. Indeed, such esoteric training today would be entirely impractical and is never practiced where such work is taken seriously. If students wish to develop, quote, out of themselves, quote, close quote, all that inspiration can offer, they could undoubtedly spin out of themselves all that has been described here. For example, matters of human nature, human life after death, the evolution of humanity and the planets, and so on. However, such students would need an immeasurably long time to do so. It would be as though we developed the whole discipline of geometry out of ourselves, with no consideration of what has already been achieved in this area. Certainly, in theory, it is fully possible, but to carry it out in fact would be foolish. Nor is this the procedure in esoteric science. Rather, a teacher passes on teachings that have been acquired for humanity by inspired predecessors. Such a tradition must, for the present, provide the basis for individual inspiration. What is offered today in literature and lectures from the realm of esoteric science absolutely can provide such a basis for inspiration. There are, for example, teachings about the various component parts of the human being, parenthesis, physical body, ether body, astral body, and so forth, close parenthesis. Knowledge of life after death, pending a new incarnation. And everything that has been printed in the book titled Cosmic Memory. In other words, it must be grasped at all points that inspiration is needed for discovering and personally experiencing the higher truths, but not for understanding them. What cosmic memory communicates cannot initially be discovered without inspiration. Once communicated, however, it can be understood through wholly ordinary logical judgment. No one should argue that what is said there cannot be grasped logically without inspiration. They are found inconceivable, not through a lack of inspiration, but because they are not given sufficient reflective consideration. When such communicated truths are received, they awaken inspiration in the soul through their own strength. If participating in such inspiration is desired, however, we must make an effort to receive such knowledge in a way that is not ordinary and nonchalant. Rather, we must open ourselves to be moved by the increase of ideas into every possible feeling experience. Why would this not be possible? Can feeling remain dull when overpowering cosmic events pass before the spirit's gaze? The way that the earth developed from moon, sun, and Saturn, or the way that knowledge of the human ether and astral bodies and so on penetrates the infinite depths of human nature? We might possibly say, how unfortunate for those who are able to remain unmoved when contemplating such forms of thought. If they did not regard them in a dull way, but lived through all the waves of tension and release of feeling that they engender, climax and crisis, progress and setback, catastrophe and dispersion, then indeed the mother substance would be prepared in them for inspiration itself. Certainly the necessary feeling life, in the face of such communications from a higher world, can be developed only through exercises like those indicated here. Those who turn all their feeling forces toward the outer world of sensory perception will see descriptions from a higher world as arid concepts, as gray theory. They will never be able to grasp why another finds the communications of esoteric science heartwarming, while their own heart remains cold to them. They may even say, "But this is only for the intellect. This is intellectual. I would like something for my welfare." But they do not admit it is their own fault that their hearts remain cold. Many still undervalue the power of what lies hidden in these communications from a higher world. And in this connection they overvalue all kinds of other exercises and procedures. Quote, what good is it to me, they say, to learn from others what the higher worlds look like? I want to see them for myself, close quote. Such persons mostly lack the patience to concentrate over and over again upon such descriptions from higher worlds. If they would do so, they would see what kindling force these mere stories have, and how one's own inspiration is stimulated by hearing an account of the inspirations of others. Certainly other exercises must supplement mere learning if students wish to make rapid progress in the experience of the higher worlds. But no one should underestimate the great significance of learning. In any case, no hope can be given that we will make rapid conquests in the higher worlds through any exercises whatever, unless we also set out to ponder incessantly upon the communications, purely narrative, that have been given from a competent source about the events and beings of the higher worlds. Now that such communications are actually being presented in literature and in lectures and so forth, and the first indications are also being given for the exercises leading to knowledge of higher worlds, parenthesis, as for example indications presented in title How to Know Higher Worlds, close parenthesis, it has now become possible to learn something of what was formerly communicated only in strictly guarded esoteric schools. As frequently mentioned, owing to the special conditions of our time, these things are necessarily published. But on the other hand, it must be continually emphasized that, while it has become easier to acquire esoteric knowledge, we should not yet completely dispense with the sure guidance of an experienced esoteric teacher. Cognition through inspiration leads us to the experience of processes in the invisible worlds, as for instance the evolution of humanity and the earth and its planetary embodiments. When we consider not only processes in these higher worlds, but also beings, then intuition must enter as a mode of cognition. What occurs through such beings is discerned through imagination in pictures and in laws and relationships through inspiration, but to come face to face with the beings themselves, intuition is needed. We will explain later how inspiration becomes articulate in the world of imagination, how inspiration permeates imagination as spiritual music, and thus becomes the means of expression for the beings who are to be known through intuition. Then intuition itself will also be dealt with. Here we will merely point out that what is designated intuition in esoteric science has nothing to do with the application of the word intuition in current popular use. Such use of the word refers to a more or less uncertain notion, in contrast to clear cognition arrived at logically through intellect or reason. In esoteric science, intuition is not vague and uncertain, but a lofty mode of cognition, full of the most luminous clarity and the most unquestionable certainty.